Hello everyone. My presentation today is a glimpse into the discourse of an ecosystem that I, guided by Dr. Radhika Session and Dr. Arnab Das, are borrowing from and lending to the Brahmaputra. I have in the recent past had the privilege of witnessing the performance of the river and receiving its friendship from various locations, physical and imaginary. And it is from such a proximity that I speak of the river and its scope within and towards the mainstay of the Maritime Research Center, underwater archaeology. Contextualizing the scope of the Brahmaputra Valley against the backdrop of riverine archaeology in India and the world, I shall engage with historiographical accounts that have assisted in foregrounding the expanse of socio-political, cultural, and economic history of the river. After which, I shall migrate towards the discourse of ethnography and memory studies to illustrate how the present landscape of the Brahmaputra Basin, a multivalent ecosystem, encourages inquiry into a spectrum that stretches from sedimentology to documentary history. Since the 2000s, the impetus from oceanic history has inched towards a more inclusive and localized approach of interconnectedness through a water-based history. As such, it is not the ocean or the sea that is studied within its boundaries. Rather, the transgressive and porous nature of water is acknowledged to incorporate sites beyond the larger water body. Concomitantly, the larger sea encompasses not just the actual sea or the ocean in question, but also rivers, streams, estuaries, deltas, uplands, and even remote mountain passes. As such, the terra-centric dichotomy between the land as center and the sea as peripheral undergoes a devaluation seen against this potential of water to transcend the fixity of the local as well as resist being cast as a world region. Oceanic history is written by separating wet sites from their dry regional, cultural, and chronological contexts, migrate towards functional universals, and the essentializing trajectory of environmental determinism. To avoid such errors in composing a people's history of rivers, we maintain scholar Rila Mukherjee's suggestion that if maritime or oceanic history is world history, then a water history incorporating regions, seas, rivers, lakes, estuaries remains a regional history, but as history of a region, not necessarily within national frames. As such, writing a water history is by all means an exercise towards a transcultural and transnational historiography with its locus at identifying the specification of relations between environment, subsistence, technology, and social ranking. The widely engaged canvas of the Nile River has steered the studies of cultural interactions of the anthropomorphic with alluvial environments forward. The Ganges and the Yangtze River have had notable archaeological investigations that have yielded material traces contributing to the reworking of historical narratives of their respective catchments, tied inextricably with larger oceanic histories as well as local conduits and instruments of interventions, tangible and intangible, that have maintained sustainable designs of interactions between waterfront people and the waters that drain their habitat. However, the Brahmaputra Valley remains neglected in this discipline despite its multifarious history that dates back to the Neolithic period. The lack of proper documentation of archaeological sites has led to the exclusion of the region from studies done in ancient and medieval Asia's maritime networks. Early scholars like Dilip Chakrabarty have noted and emphasized upon the absence of archaeological impetus in the essaying of early historic occupation in the Brahmaputra Valley. However, recent studies in both archaeological and literary sources in the Indian Northeast, and specifically Assam, have surfaced to claim the participation of the river in a larger story of Indian Ocean interactions. The history of cultures facilitated by the Brahmaputra can be traced back to the Neolithic period, confirmed by archaeological records that reveal abundant artifacts around its floodplains. The Periplus Mare Erythrae, the Greek sea guide of the 1st century AD, traces the Kauri Trail, a combination of land and sea routes connecting the Malabar Maldives maritime area to the Bengal coast and thence onwards to the Brahmaputra or Assam Valley through the Indian Northeast into the Myanmar and then on to southern China. This trail indicates the Northeast region as one of the most archaeologically significant sites due to the deposition of Indian Ocean cowries and other Indo-Pacific beads, which were sent deep into the Indian Northeast through this trail. Suchandra Ghosh informs us of Kamarup's present-day Assam importance as a hinterland of the port of Samandar in Harikela, a sub-region of Bengal identified with the present Chittagong area around the late 7th century, 8th century, with a reach up to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Known for its aloes wood and yak tails, which served as ritual items cutting across all religions like Buddhist, Brahmanical, and Islam, the movement of these materials have been documented to be supported by a river identifiable with the Brahmaputra. One second. This is an obstruction. Okay. The Brahmaputra is also replete in the humanities, spanning maritime crossings across long-distance trade routes in the Bay of Bengal. For example, in Andrea Acre's study of pre-modern Buddhist texts written about long maritime crossings along what the author terms Silk Roads of the Sea, characterized by a mix of verisimilar and imaginative elements, an Eastern Indian monk Atisa's account dedicated to an image of the Buddha Dipankara, also considered the protector of the sailor, documents a shipwreck in the Brahmaputra Valley. In Kalidasa's 7th century epic Raghuvamsa, the poet illustrates major land routes and all the large rivers that formed many internal networks within the Bengal Central Asia route. Although fiction, major land routes and large rivers, the Ganga, Lohitya or Brahmaputra, Godavari and the Kaveri, are mentioned in the text, making it unusually reliable geographically and indicating that the Bengal Central Asia route within itself included real known routes. The medieval travel Ibn Battuta's documentation of Bengal also suggests strong linkages between southeastern Bengal and Kamrupa in the Brahmaputra Valley. The Brahmaputra Valley in Assam can be identified to be divided into three ecological zones with specific geophysical characteristics and therefore distinctive socio-cultural, economic, and political utterances. The first zone, closest to the river, stretches from its banks to a few kilometers further inland and is colloquially called the Chapuris. The second zone, known as the Rupit Mahal, extends from the margins of the first to the beginning of the third zone and is characterized by flood-immune plains with fertile soil, where transplanted rice cultivation, the most important crop in the valley, is nurtured. The third zone, or the submontane zone, is scaled from the foot of the hill ranges that surround the Brahmaputra Valley from all three sides. Systematic studies demonstrated in colonial documents uh, illustrate varying levels of socioeconomic development of settlements at these ecological zones, pronouncing the middle tract the most densely populated and boasting a higher standard of living as compared to the first and the third zones. Presently, the landscape of the valley suggests continuities of such inequalities, leaving identities punctuated by contested structural hierarchical relationships. In our context, this leads us to the notion of archaeological memory as inextricably linked to ideologies, inequalities, and exclusions. As insisted by Bernbeck and McGeer, interests and agendas unwittingly insert themselves into archaeological products. In order to engage with the contested ambitions of a particular landscape, the dual and often inseparable relationship between material cultures and their symbolic means that sustain an ecosystem of social ranks, their perpetuation, legitimation, and maintenance over time, we turn towards the memories of waterfront people to demonstrate lineages of continuities and roots of resistance and change. It is perhaps well understood that the archaeology of riverine societies demands special techniques to harness its memory, as many of the early sites are likely to have been buried, obliterated, and disturbed. Therefore, the dynamics of the fluvial processes which inform the sustainability and survivability of archaeological remains and their conditions ought to be incorporated into the frameworks devised for cleaning, studying, and periodizing found material, since these dynamics influence subsistent activities, settlement location, and social relations. The Char Chapuris in Assam, an exclusive riverine phenomenon of the Brahmaputra Valley, lie at the first ecological zone of the valley as explained previously. These land masses are inherently temporary as they rise above the water, only to submerge unpredictably, thereby making the people who inhabit these land masses difficult to be enfolded within studies that attempt estimations of their population count. The nomadism of the population that resides in these precarious circumstances challenge the terracentrism of our civilizational discourse. As scholar Kuntala Lahiri Dutt suggests, besides posing a conceptual difficulty to definition, these charchapuris also wander around and disappear without notice, and are truly no one's lands, or rather, fictional entities because they cannot be legally recorded in revenue papers. As such, the charchapuris emerge as crucial sites of memory, history, with different settlements across the floodbanks of the valley. As such, the question that surfaces is, how does one harness the processes of how subjectivities are framed at such fluvial ecosystems where both landscapes and people illustrate countless legacies of migration? The attestations of this nomadism can hardly be accessed from material traces, as both the form and the subject of representation from such locations cannot help but mimic the culture of the waters. To elucidate the situation at hand, we turn to the politics of the settlement of two distinct ethnic communities, the Mishings and the Bengal origin Muslims, also called the Miyas, that occupy various landscapes fed by the Brahmaputra. Mishings, a predominantly waterfront people in the Brahmaputra Valley, identify themselves as indigenous, Bhumiputra, and tribal, Janajati. However, their ethnicity is a deeply contested one as their genealogical history and therefore their identities are informed by decades-long routes of migration and sagas of displacement ushered by physical and historical circumstances. Till the end of the 19th century, Mishings were amongst a handful of communities that inhabited the Chars, having migrated from regions within the current political boundaries of Arunachal Pradesh. Post their entry into Assam, the cultural shifts in the subsistence practices of the Mishings, emanating from their interactions with the majority Assamese population, have resulted in their adoption of intensive agriculture, a move away from their former nomadic method of shifting cultivation. During numerous political, ethno-linguistic, and infrastructural developments, the missing language of oral communication, laden with intergenerational myth and lore, became a crucial site of dialogue in the articulation of their identities, which finally led to the adoption of a modified Roman script as against the hegemonic and popularly opted for Assamese script, to encourage the representation and development of the distinctive phonemic character of missing language alongside other sociopolitical factors. However, the project of assertion of a distinctive missing identity does not end with the establishment of a script. The tribal body of the Mishings are exploited by state developmental initiatives which majorly function from the premise of the hegemonic Hindu discourse, steeped in caste-based notions of purity and pollution that run counter to tribal ideas of segregation and pollution. Therefore, sites such as the adopted Roman script, tribal philosophies, as well as the tribal body that embodies these philosophies, become crucial interfaces for understanding of the friction between tribal knowledge systems and majoritarian politics of the state. More recently, yet another case of endangered ethnicity surfaces to be that of the Bengal origin Muslim population residing in and around the Char Chaparis of Assam. Since 1905, the identities of these populations have been fraught with tensions emanating from policies and politics of regimes fueled by extractivism and exclusion. The amalgamation of East Bengal and Assam by Lord Curzon under the Bengal Breach Scheme promoted migration of landless and marginal peasants from densely populated locales of Mymensingh, Rangpur, Pabna, and Bogra in East Bengal to sparse landscapes in Lower Assam. In pursuance of increasing land revenue, uncultivated chars were forced into cultivation. These landscapes were de-reserved from their former status of professional grazing reserves, PGR, which gradually turned into settlements populated by this immigrant population. During the 1947 partition, as well as the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, intensified communal tensions led to increased migration of the population into the Indian state. The community, colloquially termed Mia, majorly by the Assamese linguistic majority of the state, found themselves pronounced as the state's official other as they increasingly settled in the valley and encouraged genealogies to sprout on Assamese soil. As we understand this community, we must note that the term Mia, literally meaning gentleman in Urdu, is a bastardized slur used derogatively against the immigrant Bengali Muslim population in Assam. Barred from acquiring land in the mainland, the Mia population was forced to retain their residencies in the most unstable of landscapes, the Chars, laden with innumerable risks to lives and livelihood. The forced localization of Mia Muslims at such precarious landscapes have made them susceptible to state and non-state stressors, leaving their identities deeply contested in the settlement discourse of the valley. Poverty, illiteracy, inequality, vulnerable livelihood options, changing social structures, and land erosion in the context of the recurring nature of water-related disasters meant a vicious cycle of loss, coping, and recovery in the Char community of Assam. Presently, the Mia communities are faced with imminent threats of disenfranchisement and statelessness. Apart from increasingly opting for the Assamese language as their lingua franca in an attempt to mitigate their already dire circumstances caused by the hostility towards the language and dialects as well as the religious orientation, the Mishings find themselves endangered. As has been evident, the ecosystems that inhabit the Brahmaputra Valley have thus derived the politics of their identities from their proximity or their distance from the turbulent Brahmaputra, in that they are unequally characterized by complex admixtures of deposition, erosion, and landscape stability that interact with cultures and their corresponding social and ideological locations to structure and inform the archaeological record. As suggested by Dyke, the deposition of sediments, bones, and objects is seen only as a reflexive and archaeologically accessible part of the processes. Here, archaeology borrows its impulses for studies of social memory from anthropology, history, and geography. Thus, in order to glean the multiple and overlapping ideologies bound within material traces, the study insists upon the potential of ethnography to be attentive to cumulative effects that ensure from across scales ranging from the history of macro-social settlements to global relations that influence a given ecosystem. As such, this interdisciplinary methodology would allow for the focus to be situated in lesser approached goals of archaeological investigations, such as spatial inequalities, community psychology, linguistics, and aesthetics, and how each of these categories inform the other. In that, the present note suggests that the archaeological memory of the Brahmaputra ought to involve the discourse of settlement and struggle of riverfront people, ensuing at the indices of culture, citizenship, and ecology. Harboring a promise of expanding the interdisciplinary contours of historical research, riverine archaeology urges the interaction between modern technology and submerged traditional knowledge systems that can yield repositories of thought and material conceived at negotiations with the transient river. Bringing these two sets of concerns together, the presentation pleads for the acknowledgement of an untapped archaeological spectrum in the Brahmaputra River basin through a careful framework curated with a scope to encompass the interdependent sources of material, literary, and oral archives in underwater archaeology. Thank you.